As you read about the story of the Aztec Empire, or as you listen to it here, it's hard not to have the ending of the story in the back of your head the whole time. Knowing that eventually the Spanish would defeat the Aztec, knowing that this would set the stage for Spanish and maybe other European colonialism for at least 300 years, knowing that it would establish a blueprint, if a blueprint hadn't already been established in the Caribbean and other places in South America, but a blueprint for violence and degradation, injustice, and how that blueprint would affect everything that happens to Mexico and even other areas beyond Mexico for hundreds of years to come, all the way up to modern history. It's hard not to play that what-if game. And maybe the ultimate what-if moment is this meeting on the causeway between the Spanish, led by Hernando Cortez, and the Aztec, led by their emperor Moctezuma. Remember that Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, is this city on the lake, situated in Lake Texcoco, and there are these land bridges or causeways that connect Tenochtitlan on the island to the rest of the Valley of Mexico on the shore. And so you can imagine this Spanish army of a couple hundred people led by Cortez marching up this causeway, and Moctezuma and his Aztec lieutenants waiting there to greet him. What would transpire at this meeting and what it would set the stage for over the next year or two would change the course of history forever. Historians don't know for a certainty what was said between Moctezuma and Cortez at this meeting. But we do know in broad strokes what happened and the end results of the meeting. Remember that the Spanish had pretty much allied with the Tlaxcalans, who were the chief rivals of the Aztec for a long time, and together they had been rampaging through Aztec territory on their way to Tenochtitlan. So Moctezuma was in a very tough political situation. It would be risky to risk an all-out battle and lose, thus losing all of your power and probably disintegrating the empire in the process. But on the other hand, you can't look too weak and totally capitulate to the Spanish, even if someone as smart as Moctezuma probably knew that he was at a severe technological disadvantage. It's very unlikely that Moctezuma just gave up his kingdom and handed it to Cortez. But he certainly did want to appease Cortez, at least at this point. So he agreed to give the Spanish food and shelter for a couple of months. He agreed to show them the tribute lists where the Aztecs got food and other goods from the surrounding city-states that they controlled. He let them have gold and jewelry. He gave them a palace to live in. Moctezuma also presented the Spanish with daughters of his as marriage alliances, perhaps trying to make some sort of diplomatic or political solution to avoid war, or perhaps just seeing how the Spanish would treat these daughters and react from there. And for a couple weeks at least, this is the situation in Tenochtitlan. The Spanish and the Mexica are living together in the same place. They're having meetings. They're feeling each other out. And of course, Cortez and the other Spanish continue to document what was going on, and they're sending letters home about what's happening in Tenochtitlan. We have to remember that Cortez still at this point was technically an outlaw. And we have to remember that everything that he's doing and everything that he's writing home about is tinted with this color of justification and explanation, and hopefully for him at least, ultimately vindication. Cortez wants to make it seem like Moctezuma just gave him the kingdom, handed him the keys to the car. Because if that's the case, then the future conquest that Cortez was planning would be a rebellion and not an active conquest by the Spanish. Remember that Cortez had no permits from the king or queen or the governor of Spain in the Caribbean to conquer anything. He was supposed to just be, quote unquote, exploring. So if he paints this picture of war as a rebellion and not an outright conquest, this is going to set him up to justify all of his actions much better eventually when he goes back to Spain. One of the things that's really interesting here is that when historians piece together all of the documents from the Spanish during this exact time period, there's plenty of contradictions and there's plenty of holes that get poked in this story that Cortez is trying to tell, that Moctezuma gave him the kingdom, that he was in complete control, that he now had Moctezuma basically in captivity under his control. Cortez claims that he stopped the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, but at the exact same time, Friar Bernal Diaz writes, quote, "The great Moctezuma continued to show his accustomed goodwill towards us, but never ceased his daily sacrifices of human beings. Cortez tried to dissuade him, but met with no success." End quote. So which is it? Did Cortez stop human sacrifice or did he not? Was he in complete control of Moctezuma or was he not? Historian Camila Townsend seems to think that in her readings of some of the Spanish documents from this moment, at times, the Spanish forgot the story. Just like that example with Bernal Diaz there. They were supposed to be falling into line with Cortez, again saying everything was under control, human sacrifice was over, and the Christianizing mission could begin. But in their letters home, they would let things slip. Historians can now poke holes in Cortez's story, and sometimes the Spanish, again, according to Camila Townsend, would actually forget and remember the story in the middle of their letters, sometimes in mid-paragraph. I guess the eraser hadn't been invented yet. Again, it's very unlikely that Moctezuma just totally gave up the kingdom, which is what Cortez would have us believe, or what many historians of the Spanish Empire would have had us believe. But in April of 1520, the situation changes drastically for Cortez and the Spanish. 800 more Spanish reinforcements had arrived on the coast, which might seem like a good thing for Cortez, but whose side were these new Spanish on? Remember that the governor of Cuba, or the governor of the Caribbean, as we've been calling him, this guy Velasquez, he hates Cortez, and he tried to revoke Cortez from going on this mission. So the governor, Velasquez, sends his own guy, a guy by the name of Narvaez. And this new guy is at the head of about 800 Spanish, and he does have all the legal permits and can act to explore the mainland in the name of the empire. But we should also remember that earlier in the story, Cortez had sent his own guy back to Spain to advocate in front of the king. And we should also mention that this is a burgeoning and bustling economy in Europe at the time. The seeds of the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World had now been planted. Waves of immigration and emigration had begun. The printing press had been established for decades at this point. And people in Spain are now seeing or hearing about the gold and the jewelry of the Aztecs. They are hearing the wild tales of exploration. Rumors are spreading like wildfire, and Cortez is becoming famous. Public opinion is being influenced, and the situation is much different than it was at the beginning of this story. But even if public opinion back in the mother country seemed to be swaying towards Cortez, the arrival of Narvaez and this group of 800 Spanish who are being sent by the governor of Cuba here is a situation that Cortez has to deal with immediately. And the arrival of these new Spanish forces the stalemate that had existed between the Mexicans and the Spanish in the city of Tenochtitlan to come to an end. Moctezuma sees these arrivals of Spanish on the coast as maybe an opportunity to divide and conquer. He begins war preparations of his own, but not before Cortez acts. He takes Moctezuma hostage and he puts him in chains. He does this because, again, he wants to seem like he's in control. And at this point, he may well be in control. But he has to convince these new Spanish arrivals that he has everything under control. So taking Moctezuma hostage, putting him in chains, this is going to help convince these new Spanish that he's in charge of the situation. Cortez then takes most of his men to go deal with Narvaez. He immediately marches out of Tenochtitlan, goes east with all the speed he has. He camps outside of the Spanish camp. He bribes some of the key men in Narvaez's inner circle, and he goes to battle in a surprise night attack. 10 people die. He captures Narvaez, and the rest of this 800-man army, essentially, promises to join him. Cortez, in turn, promises them riches and gold. Cortez now has 800 more men. He has more weapons. He has more armor. He has 80 more horses. And there's now nothing stopping him from initiating his plan of conquest. But despite what the Spanish histories would have us think, the Mexica people are not stupid or particularly superstitious when it comes to a existential political crisis, and the Aztec Empire is now in open rebellion. They see Moctezuma in chains, they see where this is going, and all of a sudden, things are getting very hairy for the few Spanish who Cortez left behind to keep control of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish were holed up in their palace compound, which gave them a solid defensive fortification to fight out of, but it also kept them in one place where the Mexica could keep an eye on them. And any Mexica person at this point who assisted the Spanish or gave the Spanish food were immediately killed by their own people. Tensions are rising in the city. There's a religious holy day of sorts for the Mexica, and they began doing some of this warlike, provocative dancing, and this really freaks out the Spanish. The guy that Cortez put in charge of these Spanish still in Tenochtitlan, a guy by the name of Alvarez, orders the attack, and the attack turns into a massacre. The Florentine Codex, a Mexica history from years after the conquest, remembers the massacre at the festival. It says, quote, "The festivity was being observed, and there was dancing and singing, with voices raised in song. The singing was like the noise of waves breaking against the rocks. When the moment had come for the Spaniards to do their killing, they came out equipped for battle. They came and closed off each of the places where people went in and out, and when they had closed these exits, they stationed themselves in each, and no one could come out anymore. When this had been done, they went into the temple courtyard to kill the people. Those whose assignment it was to do the killing just went on foot, each with his metal sword and leather shield. Then they surrounded those who were dancing, going among the cylindrical drums. They struck a drummer's arm. Both of his hands were severed. Then they struck his neck. His head landed far away. Then they stabbed everyone with iron lances and struck them with iron swords. They struck some in the belly, and then their entrails came spilling out. Those who tried to escape could go nowhere. When anyone tried to go out, at the entryways, they struck and stabbed him." End quote. The Florentine Codex also talks about some of the people who escaped the massacre, saying, quote, "Some climbed up the wall and were able to escape. Some went into the various temples and took refuge there. Some took refuge among those who had really died, feigning death. The blood of the warriors ran like water." End quote. This was the first massacre in this direct war between the Spanish and the Aztec, but it wouldn't be the last. At this point, Cortez is heading back with his army as fast as he can. Cortez is trying to paint this violence that's happening now as a rebellion against his lawful authority, but the Mexica would just call this a war. And we know from earlier in the story how brutal the Mexica at war can be. Cortez had sent one group ahead: women, children, African slaves, and animals as well. He figured that because they were going to move slowly, he had to let them go ahead of them, and then he would catch up. Bad mistake. Camilla Townsend says, quote, "Later, he would learn that a much smaller group that had traveled separately, whom he had dispatched before receiving the bad news, had in fact been attacked in a mountain pass, imprisoned, and eventually killed down to the last person and animal. This group had included Spanish women and children, enslaved Africans, and other servants carrying burdens and leading livestock. Despite what Cortez had learned about the need for numbers and cavalry, they had been sent ahead because they would travel more slowly and would need more time to cover the same ground. As it turned out, they paid for their commander's arrogant decision with their lives." End quote. As Camilla Townsend points out, this massacre of these Spanish women, children, and African slaves by the Mexica is the first interaction of these three races that we know of during this time period. And like so many things in this story, not only does it set the tone for the violence and brutality of this war, but it also sets the tone for hundreds of years of history that would come after this event. Eventually, Cortez and the Spanish army make it into the city just in time for a weeks-long urban battle to unfold. The stakes were everything, with the Spanish in their palace fortress, buttressed by steel weapons, guns, they called them the arquebus at the time, crossbows, horses, and armor. And on the other side, the Mexica, trying to infiltrate and overwhelm them with superior numbers. But they had also been blocking canals and cordoning off roads leading into the palace, trying to starve out the Spanish. It's at this point that Moctezuma, in captivity, climbs to the top of the palace and announces that the Mexica should lay down their arms. He calls for peace, saying that they are not the match of the Spanish and that they should pull back and not go to war. The Annals of Tlatelolco, another one of these Nahua histories that was recorded after the conquest, has Moctezuma saying, quote, "Let the Mexica hear. We are not their match. May the people be dissuaded from further fighting. May the arrows and shields of war be laid down. The poor old men and women, the common people, the infants who toddle and crawl, who lie in the cradle or on the cradle board and know nothing yet. All are suffering. This is why your ruler says, we are not their match. Let everyone be dissuaded." End quote. The question becomes, why would Moctezuma do this? Well, if you believe the Spanish original version of the histories here, Moctezuma is a coward. But we also have to remember that he was a prisoner and he was potentially under duress. It's also possible that Moctezuma was just practical here, and he knew that a battle would be very costly for the Mexica as a whole, men, women, and children, and even a victory might be too costly. It might leave them too weak for the other city-states and political entities of the Mexican Central Valley. Remember that this whole Aztec political control rested on their ability to exact tribute and dominate these other city-states in the region. It's also possible that Moctezuma realized that after this first round of Spanish reinforcements, the 800 more Spanish who arrived on the coast, there's nothing stopping the Spanish from continuing to send more. And you may win a victory here in Tenochtitlan, but perhaps in the long run, as more of these reinforcements come, a long-term victory might prove to be impossible. But whatever Moctezuma said on top of the palace there that day, it wasn't going to convince the enraged population of Tenochtitlan, and it particularly wasn't going to convince the war faction of his government to agree with him. This faction tells Cortez through Malintzin that they were going to fight to the death. Cortez recalls this moment saying, quote, "They were all determined to perish or have done with us. And I should look and see how full of people were all those streets and squares and rooftops. Furthermore, they had calculated that even if 25,000 of them died for every one of us, they would finish with us first. For they were many and we were but few. They told me that all the causeways into the city were dismantled, which in fact was true, for all had been dismantled save one, and that we had no way of escape except over the water. They well knew that we had few provisions left and little fresh water, and therefore could not last long, because we would die of hunger if they did not kill us first." End quote. Another Cortez quote there, and another example of how we have to separate fact from fiction every time we look at something that Cortez wrote. Obviously, what Cortez writes about a 25,000 to 1 manpower advantage for the Mexica is ridiculous and doesn't even need to be addressed here. But the other parts he talks about are more based in reality. The Mexica had been preparing for war. They were digging up canals, they were covering the causeways and preventing any exit from the city. There was only one causeway left now that led out of Tenochtitlan. And Cortez comes to the conclusion that if he and the rest of the Spanish here in Tenochtitlan were going to have any chance of survival, the only way was to get out of the city. And this sets the stage for this epic urban battle that is going to take place here. It's simply called La Noche Triste, the sad night, the night of sorrows. Cortez has his people construct man-made bridges. They're going to try to use these to cross the lake and get out of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish pack up their things. Cortez takes the gold. He takes Malintzin. He takes a few other valuable native princesses. He takes Moctezuma's children. And this final point is somewhat contested in the various histories of the Aztec Empire, but it's at this point that he probably orders the killing of Moctezuma. He has no more need for Moctezuma. In his writings, he says that it was the Mexica themselves who killed Moctezuma, but most historians seem to suspect that Cortez almost certainly played a role. Whatever the case there, Cortez orders the escape from the city, and this battle that's come to be known as the Night of Sorrows began. The Spanish are massed up, many of them are mounted, and the Mexica are surrounding them as they try to march out of the city. The man-made bridges that the Spanish had constructed failed. Warriors in canoes are stabbing at horses and men as they try to cross them. At least 56 of the 80 horses die, further clogging up the one causeway, the one exit out of the city. Bodies are piling up in the canals, and they're being used as makeshift bridges, people literally trampling over bodies in a desperate attempt to get out of the city. For the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies who were in the city, the best chance for survival was simply to be one of the first people that got out while the bridges were still standing, because once they collapsed, there was no getting out of the city. For the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans who couldn't get out of the city, it was a nightmare. The Florentine Codex remembers this night of the sorrows, saying, quote, "It was as though they had fallen off a precipice. They all fell and dropped in, the Tlaxcalans and the Spaniards, along with the horses and some women they had with them. The canal was completely full of them, full to the very top, and those who came last just passed and crossed over on people, on top of the bodies." End quote. 600 Spanish would die, probably 1,500 Tlaxcalans. But Cortez and about a third of his men were able to retreat and escape. Now, obviously, this was a massive loss for the Spanish. They lost a bunch of gold, most of their horses, most of their guns, at least 600 of their own people. Like we said again, 1,500 Tlaxcalans. And there's really no way to look back at this and paint this as anything but a disastrous night for the Spanish. And this defeat really underscores one of the main themes of this war, which often gets forgotten, which is that this was not a foregone conclusion. In the moment, at least. There were real moments here, like this battle here, where the Spanish were on the ropes. Sure, it's true that even if Cortez and all of his allies perished in Tenochtitlan, there were going to be more Europeans coming. They had the technological advantage, and probably some sort of situation similar to what ends up unfolding will unfold in the future, but we can't know that for sure. Who knows how history changes with a total Aztec victory here? Who knows how history would have changed if the Aztec had incorporated the Tlaxcalans into their empire instead of antagonizing them? Historian Inga Clendenin says, quote, "While other formidable Nahua-speaking cities and provinces were recruited into the empire, the Tlaxcalans were kept out. I have come to see their exclusion, their role as outsiders, not as an unfortunate quirk, but a structural requirement, a necessary corollary of the kind of empire the Aztec was." Asked whether he could defeat the Tlaxcalans if he so chose, Moctezuma was said to have replied that he could, but he preferred to have an enemy against whom to test his warriors and to secure high-quality victims. I believe him. How else, with campaigns increasingly fought far afield, to make real the rhetoric, the high glamour, the authenticity of risk of warriordom? The overriding metaphor of Mexican life was contest, and the political fantasy of destined dominance required a plausible antagonist/victim. That essential role had devolved onto the Tlaxcalans. They made absolutely no obeisance to the Mexican view of themselves, and they were proximate enemies, penned like gamecocks in a coop, until the Spaniards came. End quote. It's an interesting theory that the Aztec Empire needed the Tlaxcalans to exist as sort of a yin to their yang, a natural counterbalance of them to justify the policies and existence of us. So the violence and the antagonism towards the Tlaxcalans was not just a choice, but it was a deliberate reality of what the Aztec Empire was. And again, in hindsight, it turns out to be a terrible decision, right? It becomes the great irony that this Aztec Empire is brutalized by its own brutality. So it's really here where both sides are regrouping from this epic urban battle in Tenochtitlan that the outcome of this war gets decided. Like we said, both sides regroup. The Aztec in Tenochtitlan, the Spanish retreat to Tlaxcala, and both sides begin reaching out to other city-states in the area looking for allies. Were the city-states and provinces of the Central Valley of Mexico going to be loyal to the Aztec, or were they going to switch sides to the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans? The Mexica strategy was largely to offer relief in their tribute schedules. So maybe they wouldn't have to send as much food anymore and this type of thing. The Spanish offered to kill and burn any who accepted that Mexica offer. And by and large here, the Spanish offer is more persuasive. Cortez makes a conscious show of force rather than retreating. Any villages or city-states who seem sympathetic to the Aztec, he's going on night raids, looting and burning. And he also has his great weapon, Malinche. She's taking a pragmatic approach and informing these villages and provinces and city-states that more Spanish are coming. And in the long run, this is a foregone conclusion. So these areas that were previously under Aztec control are getting hit from all sides. They're being attacked, they're being threatened, they're getting hit with this Malinchen version of diplomacy, and now they're also getting hit with disease. The smallpox that would end up decimating millions of people in the Americas finally sank its teeth in. It probably came from the ship of Narvaez, maybe one of the passengers on that ship. And we have to remember that most Europeans were immune to this disease, but not the people in the Americas. It wreaked havoc, killing scores of people. Nobody seemed to have a good answer for it. And by April of 1521, more reinforcements from Spain had been trickling in, and Cortez finds himself in possession of an additional 1,000-person army. Cortez had been sending gold and men back to the Caribbean to buy resources and weapons. Cortez writes, quote, "When on the 28th of April, 1521, I called all my men out on parade and reckoned with 86 horsemen, 118 crossbowmen and harquebussers, some 700 foot soldiers with swords and bucklers, 3 large iron guns, 15 small bronze field guns, and 1,000 weight of powder. We knew well that God had helped us more than we had hoped." End quote. Small-scale skirmishes are happening. There are some Aztec victories, but the Spanish are largely dominant, again, especially when they can mass on an open field. The night raids and the killings are still happening, and Malinchen is still trying to convert city-states. One major city-state by the name of Texcoco is converted to the cause. Others would follow. Like we said, the smallpox is still devastating people inside of Tenochtitlan and in the surrounding provinces. Cortez's plan to assault the city is that they're going to build boats. No more causeways. They are raiding along the lake from these boats. Inside the city, there's a bit of infighting as the sons of Moctezuma are killed and any anti-war nobles are killed. Cortez uses cannon to destroy obstructions, and he tries to create flat ground where his horses and lances can win the day. Once inside the city of Tenochtitlan, there is literally neighborhood by neighborhood fighting. The Aztec makes some heroic captures of Spanish soldiers and sacrifice them. It would not be enough. Later on in their histories, the Mexica people would point to the iron weapons of the Spanish as one of the key reasons that they lost this battle. But they also pointed to the incredible logistics and technology, in their view, that allowed the Spanish to communicate far overseas and respond to the challenges that they needed to in order to win the war. Camilla Townsend talks about this certain Nahua people remembering the events of the conquest, saying, quote, "When the elderly speakers paused in wonder at the events, it was to ask how the word had gone out so efficiently to so many people across the sea about their marvelous kingdom. The warriors had seen the ships, but not the compasses, the navigation equipment, the technical maps, and the printing presses that made the conquest possible. What is striking is how quickly they realized that these issues were at the heart of the matter." End quote. After about 3 months of fighting in Tenochtitlan, the war was all but over. The Spanish had won, and the massacre could begin. Towards the end, Cortez wrote, quote, "We could not help but be saddened by their determination to die." End quote. This is a line that you see a lot in the histories, and many see it as Cortez's excuse to justify these massacres. They wanted to die, right? Historian Inga Clendenin takes up the tale, saying, quote, "There followed a massacre of men who no longer had arrows, javelins, or stones, of women and children stumbling and falling on the bodies of their own dead. Cortez thought 40,000 might have died or been taken on that day." End quote. She goes on to say, quote, "The city was now a stinking desolation of heaped and rotting bodies of starving men, women, and children crawling among them or struggling in the water." End quote. Clendenin claims that the Spanish were brutal and killers here, but the Tlaxcalans were especially brutal. Talking about Cortez unleashing the allies, the Tlaxcalans mostly, she says, quote, "He had seen to the phobic cruelty of the allies, most especially the Tlaxcalans. He had known that cruelty before and had used and profited from it. But on that last day of killing, they had killed and killed, amid a wailing of women and children so terrible," quoting from Cortez's letters now, quote, "that there was not one amongst us whose heart did not bleed at the sound." End quote. From the Mexica side of things, the annals of Tlatelolco say, quote, "On the roads lay shattered bones and scattered hair. The houses were unroofed, red with blood. Worms crawled on the roads, and the walls of the houses were slippery with brains." End quote. By mid-August 1521, it's over. The city lay in ruins, its people decimated. Cuauhtémoc, the new Aztec emperor and the leader of the war faction at this point, gives himself up. He asks the Spanish to stop the killing and that his people be allowed to head back to the city-states or provinces where their families were, or where they originally came from. Those that could left the city. Historian Camilla Townsend says that as they were leaving, they could hear the cries and lamentations of people left behind. Some young women captured by Spanish and kept in the city with them. And although the story of the Mexica people is not over yet, it may have felt that way in the moment. Historian Inga Clendenin cites a Nahua poem and tries to get at the feeling of what it might have felt like to be on the tail end of this conquest and massacre. She says, quote, "A particular section of the Annals of Tlatelolco is often cited to demonstrate the completeness of the obliteration of a way of life and a way of thought. It runs," and here's the Nahua poem now, quote, "Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. Worms are swarming in the streets and plazas, and the walls are splattered with gore. The water is turned red as if it were dyed, and when we drink it, it has the taste of brine. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls, for our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead. The shields of our warriors were its defense, but they could not save it." If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.